This stuff, I mean, can be really nasty. And now suspend in your mind the idea that I'm being sued for, obviously, for sounding like myself. These people that are suing me hold a copyright worth millions of dollars to them. And I've written a new song, and they want to contend that the new song plagiarizes their song. That kind of lawsuit happens occasionally, where it happened to George Harrison.
Imagine writing a song so distinct that it defines a generation, only to be sued years later for copying yourself. In 1985, John Fogerty found himself in this surreal position. The former frontman of Creedence Clearwater Revival, or CCR, had written some of the most iconic rock songs of the late 60s and early 70s. But when he released The Old Man Down the Road as a solo artist, his former record label claimed it was a ripoff of Run Through the Jungle, a song he had written for CCR. This lawsuit was just one chapter in a long battle between Fogerty and Fantasy Records, the label that owned CCR's music. Years of disputes over contracts, royalties, and creative control had already pushed him to sever ties with his former bandmates, but the legal fight over his own songwriting style took things to another level. John Fogerty's early life and the formation of CCR. John Cameron Fogerty was born May 28, 1945 in Berkeley, California. Growing up in El Cerrito, he was drawn to music at an early age, listening to records by early rock pioneers like Little Richard and Elvis Presley. He and his older brother, Tom Fogerty, both played guitar, but it was John who quickly took to songwriting and arranging. By the late 50s, he had formed a band with his high school friends Stu Cook and Doug Clifford, originally called the Blue Velvets. In 1964, the band signed with Fantasy Records, which rebranded them as the Gollywogs. The name change was not their decision, but they had little control over the label's marketing. Despite releasing several singles, they struggled to gain attention. Fogerty, who had begun taking a more dominant role in the band's sound, felt frustrated by their lack of direction. It wasn't until 1967 that they changed their name to Creedence Clearwater Revival, a move that signaled a shift towards the sound that would soon make them one of America's biggest bands. Quote, "I felt like I was the only one pushing forward," Fogerty later said. "I was always the guy who had the vision, who was looking ahead, but it wasn't easy when the label and even my own band didn't always see it." By 1968, CCR had found its breakthrough with Susie Q, a cover of the rockabilly classic that showcased Fogerty's sharp guitar work and raw vocals. Success and sound of CCR. By the late 60s, CCR had become one of the biggest bands in America. Their sound was raw and unmistakable, tight blues-driven rock with a southern influence, despite the fact that the band was from California. John Fogerty's voice, a gritty wail that carried a sense of urgency, became the band's defining feature. His songwriting tapped into the cultural moment, blending personal storytelling with themes of war, protest, and working-class struggles. Hits like Proud Mary, Bad Moon Rising, and Fortunate Son dominated the airwaves. Between 1968 and 70, the band released 5 albums, each packed with now-classic songs. They played a relentless schedule, touring extensively and appearing at major festivals, including Woodstock in 1969. While other bands from that era experimented with psychedelic sounds and long instrumental jams, CCR kept their music lean and direct. Quote, "I didn't want 10-minute solos," Fogerty said years later. "I wanted songs that grabbed people right away." Despite the success, there were early signs of trouble within the band. John Fogerty controlled nearly every aspect of their music. He wrote the songs, sang lead, played lead guitar, arranged the tracks, and even dictated how they should be performed. Some critics and fans saw it as a sign of his brilliance, but his bandmates saw it differently. Over time, resentment grew, especially from his brother Tom, who felt overshadowed.
And Tom said something like, "Oh, so now you're going to produce the cover like you produced the records." But he wasn't happy when he said it, and I just thought to myself, ouch.
Still, for a brief period, CCR seemed unstoppable. Their songs became the soundtrack of an era, resonating with both mainstream listeners and those protesting the Vietnam War. The fall of Creedence Clearwater Revival. By 1970, CCR was one of the most successful bands in the world, but tensions behind the scenes were tearing them apart. John, who had always been the driving force behind the band, was increasingly at odds with his bandmates. One of the biggest sources of friction was their relationship with Fantasy Records and its owner, Saul Zaentz. When CCR had signed with Fantasy in the mid-60s, they had little bargaining power. As a result, they agreed to a contract that heavily favored the label, giving away control of their publishing rights. Once the band became successful, Fogerty realized just how bad the deal was, but there was little he could do to change it. His frustration with Fantasy Records only deepened the rift between him and the rest of the band. In 1971, Tom Fogerty quit, fed up with his brother's leadership style and the mounting conflicts. That left John, bassist Stu Cook, and drummer Doug Clifford to carry on as a trio. When it came time to record their next album, Mardi Gras, John made a surprising decision. He stepped back and let Cook and Clifford take equal roles in songwriting and singing. Many saw this as a form of sabotage. Critics panned the album, and even Cook later admitted it was a disaster. The album's failure marked the end of the band. In late 1972, CCR officially disbanded.
I'm not on speaking terms, really. It's not easy, but I had my brother Bob call up the other bandmates, and after they first pretended not to know anything about it, we finally learned that the other three guys have sold their voting right in Creedence to Saul Zaentz, my worst enemy.
The legal nightmare. After CCR dissolved, John Fogerty walked away from the band, but not the troubles that came with it. The biggest problem was his contract with Fantasy Records. As part of CCR's original deal, the label retained ownership of their catalog, meaning Fogerty had no control over the rights to the songs he had written. Even worse, he was still contractually obligated to deliver more music to Fantasy, despite having no desire to work with them. Quote, "I felt like I was in a prison," Fogerty later said. "I had to write songs for the very people who had ripped me off." In an act of defiance, he refused to play CCR songs for years. Instead, he tried to move forward as a solo artist, releasing the Blue Ridge Rangers in 1973, which consisted entirely of cover songs, his way of avoiding any further disputes over songwriting royalties. But the financial and legal pressure from Fantasy Records never let up. Saul Zaentz, the label's owner, was relentless in exploiting CCR's music, re-releasing compilations and licensing songs without Fogerty's involvement. To make matters worse, they withheld royalties, leading to an extended legal battle over money owed to him. The situation reached absurd heights in 1985 when Fogerty released his solo album Centerfield. The record was a comeback moment for him, proving he could still write his own hits. But Fantasy Records saw an opportunity to strike. They filed a lawsuit claiming that one of the album's standout tracks, The Old Man Down the Road, was essentially a rewrite of CCR's Run Through the Jungle. The catch? Fogerty had written both songs. In one of the most bizarre copyright cases in rock history, he found himself being sued for plagiarizing himself. The lawsuit was more than just a financial burden, it was a personal attack. Zaentz had also sued Fogerty over another Centerfield track, Zaentz Can't Dance, which was a thinly veiled jab at the record executive. The song, about a dishonest pig who, quote, can't dance but he'll steal your money, was quickly pulled and reworked after the lawsuit. Later in life, Saul Zaentz tried to apologize to Fogerty.
I looked at him and said, "Stu, you go fix all those things that are still hurting me now that you set in motion, and then maybe I'll listen to your apology. But right now, it's a pretty empty apology. Okay. I'm still being clobbered."
John strikes back. John refused to back down. The idea that he could be sued for plagiarizing his own work was beyond absurd, and he was determined to fight it. The case went to trial in 1988, where Fogerty took an unconventional approach to defending himself. He brought his guitar into the courtroom. In a move rarely seen in copyright disputes, he played both The Old Man Down the Road and Run Through the Jungle, demonstrating to the jury how the songs were structurally and melodically different. His live explanation worked. The jury ruled in his favor, rejecting Fantasy Records' claim that he had copied himself. The lawsuit had drained him financially, though, having to spend years fighting a claim that should never have been filed in the first place. He took the battle one step further by countersuing Saul Zaentz for malicious prosecution. The case made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in '94 that the artists had right to seek legal fees if they were forced to defend themselves against baseless copyright claims. The ruling was a landmark moment not just for Fogerty, but for musicians who had long been at the mercy of predatory record contracts. Now it's time to hear from you. Should an artist ever be sued for sounding like themselves? Let us know in the comments section below.